Before we begin, a quick update. We're now on Spotify. Just search for Sherlock Holmes Sleep Stories on Spotify and you'll find us. From now on, we'll be posting new episodes there every single day, and we won't be uploading here anymore. The link is also in the description. See you on Spotify.
Welcome to What If Sleep Storian, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more Nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The frost had painted its delicate architecture across the windows of 221B Baker Street, each crystalline pattern a small masterpiece that would melt with morning's touch. Outside, London wore its December face, gas lamps glowing like amber pearls along the street, their light softening the edges of a city that rarely showed such kindness. Snow had fallen earlier in the afternoon, not the heavy blanketing sort that stops hansoms in their tracks, but the fine, powdery kind that dusts the shoulders of gentlemen and settles into the cracks between cobblestones like sugar into tea. Inside, the sitting room breathed warmth. The fire in the hearth crackled and whispered secrets to itself, sending shadows dancing across the Persian rug that had seen better days but refused to surrender its faded elegance. The scent of Mrs. Hudson's mince pies drifted up from below, cinnamon and brandy, dried fruit and sweet pastry, the smell of Christmas approaching with patient inevitability. It mingled with the smell of pipe tobacco, old books, and something chemical from Holmes' latest experiment, a combination that would have driven most people to open a window despite the cold, but which Watson had long ago accepted as the signature fragrance of home. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favourite armchair, the one positioned to catch both firelight and the lamp's glow, his long fingers moving across the strings of his violin. He wasn't playing anything in particular, no Mendelssohn tonight, no Paganini, just drawing the bow slowly, thoughtfully, producing notes that hung in the air like questions waiting for answers. His grey eyes, half closed, seemed focused on something beyond the room, beyond London itself, perhaps on nothing at all. It was the time of year when even his restless mind occasionally consented to rest, when the city's criminal element retreated to their own firesides and left Baker Street blessedly quiet. Dr. John Watson occupied the chair opposite, his solid frame relaxed in a way that spoke of a man who had finally learned to enjoy peace after years of not having any. The evening paper lay across his lap, unread for the past 10 minutes while he simply watched the fire and listened to Holmes' meandering melody. His thoughts drifted pleasantly, to the patients he'd seen that day, to the cold walk home, to the warmth of his waistcoat, to the fact that Christmas was less than a fortnight away and he still hadn't settled on a gift for Holmes, though he knew from experience that Holmes would claim not to want anything while secretly being pleased by whatever Watson chose. This was Victorian London at its most forgiving, when the relentless press of industry paused just long enough to let people remember what comfort felt like. Outside these walls, the city stretched in all directions, a vast organism of 4 million souls, each pursuing their own small dramas beneath the same grey sky. Clerks hurried home to modest lodgings in Clerkenwell. Society ladies prepared for evening entertainments in Mayfair. In the East End, families crowded around inadequate fires and made do with what little they had. The great machine of empire clanked and hissed even in December. But here, in this particular room, time moved like honey. Watson shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "I was thinking," he said, not really expecting Holmes to respond, "that Mrs. Hudson has outdone herself this year. Those pies smell positively sinful." Holmes' bow paused mid-stroke. "She makes them every December, Watson. The same recipe her mother taught her in 1834, if I recall her telling us correctly. Predictable, but admittedly effective." The bow resumed its wandering path. "Though I believe she's added more brandy this year. The scent has a sharper note to it. Either that or she's sampling her own cooking more liberally than usual." "You could simply enjoy them without analysis," Watson suggested mildly. "Where would be the pleasure in that?" Watson smiled and returned to the paper, though his eyes didn't quite focus on the print. The room settled back into its comfortable quiet, broken only by the fire's conversation with itself and the violin's soft musing. Outside, a hansom clattered past, its horse's hooves muffled by the snow, the driver's call to his fare barely audible through the frost-painted glass. It was the sort of evening when nothing of consequence should happen, when the world tacitly agreed to let well enough alone. Which was, of course, precisely when the stairs began to protest under an unusually heavy tread. Holmes's bow stopped, his eyes opened fully, fixing on the door with the alert intensity of a cat that's heard something it doesn't quite like. Watson looked up from his paper, his own expression shifting from relaxed to curious. The footsteps were slow, measured, and unmistakable. They spoke of a large man climbing stairs with the careful dignity of someone who found the exercise beneath him but necessary nonetheless. There was a particular rhythm to them, a cadence that Holmes recognised as surely as he'd recognise his own reflection. "Mycroft," Holmes said quietly, lowering the violin to his lap. Watson's eyebrows rose. "Your brother? Here?" He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, 8:30. "But he never leaves the Diogenes Club after 7, unless he's heading directly home to his lodgings. Never visits Baker. Street except on official business, and official business doesn't wear evening shoes on snowy pavements." Holmes set the violin aside with unusual care, his full attention now fixed on the door. An official business certainly doesn't climb stairs quite that slowly, as if gathering courage with each step. The footsteps reached the landing, paused. Then came the knock, 3 measured raps that somehow managed to sound both authoritative and reluctant. "Come in, brother mine," Holmes called, and there was something in his voice Watson had rarely heard, a note of genuine curiosity tinged with the faintest edge of concern. The door opened to reveal Mycroft Holmes in all his considerable glory. He was a large man, not fat but substantial, the sort of person who seemed to occupy more space than his physical dimensions warranted. His overcoat was dotted with melting snow, his collar turned up against the cold, his face ruddy from the winter air. But it was his expression that arrested attention. Mycroft Holmes, the man whose mind contained the workings of the British government, whose memory held more state secrets than the walls of Whitehall, whose composure was as legendary as his intellect, looked distinctly flustered. "Sherlock," he said, his voice carrying its usual depth but lacking its customary certainty. "Watson, good evening." "Good Lord," Watson murmured, half rising from his chair. "Mycroft, are you quite well?" "Sit down, man. You look discomposed," Holmes finished, and there was unmistakable delight glinting in his eyes. "Disturbed. Dare I say, rattled?" He gestured to the chair near the fire. "Please, do sit before you distress Watson further. He's beginning to mentally catalogue which of his medical instruments might be required." Mycroft moved into the room with the careful movements of a man navigating unfamiliar territory, though he'd been in this sitting room dozens of times before. He lowered himself into the offered chair, which creaked in protest, and accepted Watson's instinctive offer to take his overcoat and hat. For a long moment he simply sat there, his large hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the fire as if it might contain answers he was reluctant to seek elsewhere. Holmes waited. It was a particular kind of waiting, patient, expectant, and quietly amused. He'd learned long ago that Mycroft on the defensive was a rare and fascinating phenomenon, like watching a battleship run aground. Whatever had driven his brother out into a December evening and up the stairs of 221B Baker Street was clearly no small matter, at least not to Mycroft. "I find myself," Mycroft began slowly, each word chosen with diplomatic precision, "in a situation that is delicate." "Delicate," Holmes repeated, savouring the word. "How wonderfully vague. Do go on." Mycroft shot him a look that would have withered lesser men. "I require your assistance, and more importantly, your absolute discretion." Watson, who had settled back into his chair with the air of a man preparing for a show, cleared his throat. "You have our discretion, of course, and whatever help we can provide." "The government hasn't fallen, has it?" Holmes asked with mock concern. "Only I haven't read the evening papers yet, and Watson tends to skim past the political sections in favour of the medical notices and society gossip." "I do not read society gossip," Watson protested. "You absolutely do. You spent 15 minutes last week reading about the Duchess of Somewhere's ball." "That was research for a case." "We didn't have a case." Mycroft's hands tightened slightly on his knees. "If you two have quite finished," he said, his voice strained, "I would appreciate attending to the matter at hand." Holmes immediately sobered, though amusement still danced at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, forgive me. You were saying something has occurred that is delicate." Mycroft took a breath, seeming to gather himself. When he spoke, the words came out with the careful control of a man confessing to something he'd rather carry to his grave. "This afternoon, I stopped at the Diogenes Club for my usual 2 hours. I occupied my customary chair in the stranger's room, read 3 newspapers, reviewed a memorandum from the Foreign Office, and departed at precisely 7 o'clock, as is my habit." He paused. Holmes made a small gesture for him to continue. "Upon returning to my lodgings and changing for the evening, I discovered that a certain document was no longer in my possession, a small folded list that I had placed in my inner waistcoat pocket before leaving my office. Stolen, Watson asked, his military instincts immediately engaged. Lost, Mycroft corrected, or rather, misplaced. The distinction is important." Holmes leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And this list contains—" "Nothing of national significance," Mycroft said quickly, too quickly. "Nothing that would compromise security or endanger lives. It is not, in the conventional sense, important." "And yet," Holmes observed, "here you are, at 8:30 on a December evening, having abandoned your comfortable lodgings and ventured out into the snow to seek my help, which suggests that while this list may not be important in the conventional sense, it is desperately important in some other sense entirely." Mycroft's jaw tightened. The firelight caught the snowmelt on his coat, making it glisten. Outside, a church bell tolled the 3/4 hour, its sound muffled by distance and winter air. "The contents," Mycroft said finally, "are of a personal nature. Should they become public knowledge, or even should they be seen by certain individuals, I would face a degree of embarrassment that I am not prepared to endure, particularly not during the Christmas season, when gossip flows as freely as punch at society gatherings." Holmes's eyes widened slightly. Genuine surprise, Watson noted, which was itself a rare thing. "Personal? You?" He sat back in his chair, openly delighted now. "My dear Mycroft, I didn't know you possessed anything so human as embarrassment. This is a revelation. What could possibly be on this list? Love poetry you've penned to the Prime Minister? Secret recipes for Christmas pudding? A catalogue of emotions you've been collecting?" "Sherlock," Mycroft said, and his voice held warning. But Holmes was warming to the theme. "No, wait, I have it. It's a list of gifts you intend to purchase for people, isn't it? Actual thoughtful presents that would reveal you occasionally think of others with something approaching fondness. How mortifying for a man of your reputation." The silence that followed was answer enough. Watson, who had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, leaned forward. "Mycroft, if it's simply a shopping list, surely that's not so terrible. Many people make such lists at Christmas." "Many people," Mycroft said heavily, "are not supposed to be the cold, calculating engine of governmental efficiency. Many people have not spent decades cultivating a reputation for complete emotional detachment. Many people do not have colleagues, rivals, and subordinates who would seize upon any evidence of sentiment as proof of weakness." Holmes was grinning now, actually grinning. An expression that transformed his usually austere features into something almost boyish. "This is marvellous. Absolutely marvellous. The great Mycroft Holmes, brought low by a shopping list. Oh, this is better than Christmas itself." "Will you help me or not?" Mycroft demanded, and there was real distress beneath the irritation now. The grin faded but didn't quite disappear. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to his brother, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that Watson blinked. "Of course I'll help," Holmes said, his voice gentler now, though I reserve the right to enjoy myself enormously in the process. "When did you last remember having the list?" Mycroft visibly relaxed, just a fraction. "At the Diogenes Club. I'm certain it was in my pocket when I sat down. I remember feeling it there, the paper against my ribs. But when I reached my lodgings and changed clothes, the pocket was empty." "Then that's where we'll begin." Holmes turned to Watson. "What do you say, old friend? Fancy a walk through snowy London to investigate the case of the missing shopping list?" Watson was already reaching for his coat. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Mycroft stood, recovering some of his usual dignity. "I must insist on complete discretion. No one at the club can know what we're searching for. The membership includes half the important men in London. The silent half, Holmes murmured, helping Watson into his coat. The ones who find even casual conversation too taxing. Yes, I'm familiar with your peculiar sanctuary, Mycroft. Don't worry. We'll be the souls of discretion. He paused, then added with studied innocence. Unless, of course, I find the investigation so amusing that I'm moved to write it up for Watson to publish. The adventure of the embarrassing shopping list. It has a certain ring to it. Sherlock. I'm joking, brother, mostly. Holmes reached for his own coat, his movements brisk now with purpose. The earlier languor had vanished entirely, replaced by the focused energy Watson knew so well. Here was Holmes with a puzzle, even if that puzzle was smaller and stranger than his usual fare. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion of coats and preparations. She took in the scene, Mycroft looking harried, Holmes looking delighted, Watson looking game, and shook her head with the weary wisdom of a woman who'd seen too much strangeness under her roof to be surprised any more. "Will you be wanting those pies when you return?" she asked. "Keep them warm for us," Holmes said, winding his scarf with quick efficiency. "We're off to rescue my brother's reputation from the clutches of the Diogenes Club. We shan't be long." As they descended the stairs and emerged into the December evening, the cold hit them like a physical thing. The snow had begun again, soft flakes drifting down through the lamplight, and somewhere in the distance someone was playing a Christmas carol badly on a penny whistle. Holmes breathed deeply, his breath misting in the frozen air. "You know, Watson," he said cheerfully, "I was just thinking this evening was too quiet, too peaceful. I should have known the universe would provide." Watson pulled his coat tighter and smiled. "Lead on, Holmes. Let's find this list before Mycroft expires of embarrassment." And so they set off into the London night, 3 figures moving through the snow, the detective, the doctor, and the mortified bureaucrat, on the trail of the smallest, strangest case Baker Street had ever seen. The fire in 220 Armby would burn low before they returned, but Mrs. Hudson, with the patience of saints, would keep the mince pies warm. Some things, after all, were more important than mysteries. The journey from Baker Street to Pall Mall was not a long one, but on this particular December evening it felt like travelling through a different London entirely, one painted in shades of silver and shadow, where the familiar city transformed into something almost dreamlike under its blanket of fresh snow. The 3 men moved through streets that seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something, though what that something might be, even Holmes couldn't deduce. Their footsteps crunched softly against the powder that had settled over the pavement, each step leaving a temporary mark that the still-falling snow would soon erase, as if the city preferred not to remember who walked through it after dark. Gas lamps cast pools of amber light at regular intervals, each one haloed by the snow drifting through its glow. The effect was oddly beautiful, Watson thought, like walking through a series of small, warm rooms suspended in the cold darkness. Between the lamps, shadows gathered and whispered, and the facades of buildings rose up on either side like the walls of a canyon carved from brick and Portland stone. Here and there, signs of the approaching Christmas season revealed themselves to those willing to look. A wreath hung on a door in Regent Street, its evergreen branches already dusted white. Through a window on Piccadilly, Watson caught a glimpse of a family gathered around a piano, their mouths open in what must have been carol singing, though the snow-muffled world allowed no sound to escape. A street vendor, packing up his chestnut brazier for the night, called out a tired greeting as they passed, his breath forming clouds that hung in the still air like small, temporary ghosts. Mycroft walked with the steady determination of a man who desperately wanted this entire episode concluded, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, his collar still turned up against the cold. He hadn't spoken since they'd left Baker Street, his usual eloquence apparently frozen along with the rest of him. Every so often, Watson caught him shooting sidelong glances at Sherlock, as if trying to determine whether his younger brother was truly committed to helping or simply savouring the spectacle of Mycroft's discomfort. Knowing Holmes as he did, Watson suspected it was very much both. Holmes himself seemed almost buoyant, despite, or perhaps because of, the cold. He moved through the snow with the easy grace of a man in his element, his sharp eyes taking in everything. The pattern of foot traffic in the snow, the lights burning in various buildings, the distant sound of a policeman's whistle, the way the wind carried the scent of coal smoke and roasting meat from a nearby chop house. His mind was clearly engaged now, turning over the problem, examining it from angles that would never occur to ordinary men. "Tell me, Mycroft," Holmes said, suddenly breaking the silence. "Was the stranger's room particularly crowded this afternoon?" Mycroft considered. "No more than usual. Perhaps a dozen members. The weather keeps some away, those who live farther out and prefer not to make the journey in snow." "And did you speak with anyone?" "Sherlock, you know perfectly well that speaking is forbidden in all but the stranger's room, and even there it's actively discouraged. I nodded to Havisham when I arrived, acknowledged Lord Blackwood's presence with a gesture, and that was the extent of my social interaction. As is proper." "As is proper," Holmes echoed, amusement threading through his voice. God forbid anyone at the Diogenes Club actually engage in conversation. The sheer exhaustion of it all. They turned onto Pall Mall, and the street opened before them in all its imperial grandeur. This was the heart of gentlemen's London, where the great clubs stood shoulder to shoulder, like stern uncles at a family gathering, each more imposing than the last. The buildings here spoke of power exercised quietly, of decisions made in leather-upholstered rooms, while servants glided silently with decanters of port, of an England that ran on unspoken understandings and the proper observance of ritual. The Reform Club glowed with warm light, its windows revealing glimpses of well-fed gentlemen settling in for the evening. The Athenaeum stood dark and scholarly, as if it had fallen asleep while reading something particularly dense, and there, between the Carlton and the Oxford and Cambridge, stood the Diogenes Club, the strangest, most peculiar establishment of them all. From the outside it looked much like its neighbours, a solid Georgian building of good proportions, with the same air of understated wealth and permanent respectability. But those who knew, and few did, for the Diogenes Club guarded its privacy as jealously as a dragon guards gold, understood that behind that conventional facade lived something quite extraordinary. The Diogenes Club was a sanctuary for London's most unsociable men, for those brilliant misanthropic souls who found even casual human interaction an unbearable drain on their resources, for men who loved their newspapers, their solitude, and their silence in equal measure. It was, Mycroft had once explained to Watson, a place where one could enjoy all the comforts of a gentleman's club, the chairs, the papers, the excellent brandy, without any of the tiresome obligation to be pleasant to one's fellow members. Silence was not merely encouraged at the Diogenes Club, it was enforced with an almost religious fervour. Except in the stranger's room, a single chamber set aside for those rare occasions when a member absolutely had to speak to someone, no conversation was permitted anywhere in the building, not in the reading rooms, not in the dining room, not even in the hallways. Members communicated when they had to through elaborate systems of gestures and written notes passed via the servants. The club maintained its own peculiar semaphore of meaningful looks and significant pauses. To break the silence was to be expelled immediately and permanently, one's name struck from the rolls as if one had never existed. The Diogenes Club did not believe in second chances. "I've always found it deeply ironic," Holmes murmured as they approached the building's entrance, "that a club dedicated to silence requires a special room where speech is permitted. If everyone truly preferred quiet, surely such a room would remain perpetually empty." "You misunderstand the purpose," Mycroft replied stiffly. "The stranger's room exists precisely so that necessary conversations can occur without contaminating the rest of the club. It's quarantine, essentially. We contain the infection of speech in one designated space." "How wonderfully misanthropic. I'm almost tempted to apply for membership myself." "You would be blackballed within minutes. You talk incessantly." "I most certainly do not. You're talking right. Now." "Only because the situation demands it. I can be silent when silence serves a purpose." Watson, listening to this exchange, hid a smile. The brothers Holmes could not help but bicker, even in the middle of a crisis, or what passed for a crisis in Mycroft's carefully ordered world. But beneath the bickering, there was genuine affection, the kind that only siblings who'd survived childhood together could share. They spoke the same language, thought in the same patterns, understood each other's minds with an intimacy that excluded everyone else. Watson sometimes wondered what it would have been like to grow up alongside Sherlock Holmes, to have that formidable intellect as a constant companion and competitor, exhausting, probably, but never boring. The entrance to the Diogenes Club was marked by nothing more than a discreet brass plaque and a door of polished oak that had known the touch of thousands of gloved hands. A doorman materialized as they approached, his face carefully neutral, his livery immaculate despite the late hour. He recognized Mycroft immediately. Of course he did. Mycroft was likely the club's most prominent member, and opened the door without a word, bowing them inside with practiced efficiency. The warmth hit them first, a wall of heated air that smelled of beeswax polish, old leather, cigar smoke, and something else that Watson couldn't quite identify but which reminded him vaguely of libraries and law offices and other places where important men conducted important business in hushed tones. Then came the silence. It was not the absence of sound, exactly. The building was full of small noises, the crackle of fires in various grates, the soft tick of a long case clock somewhere, the whisper of turning pages, the faint clink of glass on wood as a servant delivered a brandy to some unseen member. But the human voice, that most common and expected of sounds in any public gathering, was entirely absent. No one spoke. No one coughed unnecessarily. No one cleared their throat or hummed or engaged in any of the small, unconscious noises that usually punctuate human presence. The effect was profoundly unsettling, like walking through a museum after closing time, or a church where all the congregation had been replaced by wax figures. The entrance hall was panelled in dark wood that gleamed with decades of careful maintenance. Oil paintings hung on the walls, stern men in wigs, pastoral scenes, a rather good maritime piece showing a ship in full sail. A grand staircase curved upward toward the upper floors, its banister worn smooth by countless hands. Everything spoke of solidity, permanence, and the quiet confidence of men who knew their place in the world and were perfectly content with it. A servant appeared, elderly and dignified, moving with the silent grace of a man who'd spent his entire career learning not to disturb. He looked at Mycroft with raised eyebrows, a question conveyed without words, and Mycroft made a subtle gesture that apparently communicated everything necessary. The servant nodded fractionally and glided away, presumably to prepare whatever Mycroft had just requested. "The stranger's room is this way," Mycroft murmured, his voice automatically dropping to barely more than a whisper. Even here, in the one part of the club where speech was theoretically permitted, the habit of silence was strong. He led them down a corridor whose walls were lined with glass-fronted bookcases containing matched sets of important works, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Macaulay's History of England, bound volumes of the Edinburgh Review going back decades. The carpet beneath their feet was thick enough to swallow sound, Persian or perhaps Turkish, its pattern of interlocking medallions worn in the centre from years of traffic, but still vibrant at the edges. They passed open doorways offering glimpses into other rooms, a library where men sat in leather chairs with newspapers held before them like shields, a smaller chamber where a single elderly gentleman dozed before a fire, his spectacles sliding down his nose, a dining room where a late supper was being consumed in utter silence, the only sounds the careful click of cutlery against china. Watson found himself holding his breath, as if the silence were a physical thing that might shatter at the slightest provocation. He'd been in quiet places before, hospital wards late at night, empty churches, the Afghan desert under stars, but this was different. This was silence as ideology, as statement, as a wall erected against the intrusive chaos of the speaking world. The stranger's room, when they reached it, was smaller than Watson had expected but comfortably appointed. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate. Several armchairs were arranged in conversational groupings, their leather worn to buttery softness. A sideboard held decanters of various spirits and a stack of clean glasses. The walls were papered in a deep burgundy pattern that would have been oppressive in a larger space, but here felt almost cosy, and it was absolutely empty. "I sat there," Mycroft said, pointing to a chair positioned near the fire but not too close, angled to catch the light from a nearby lamp. From approximately 5:15 until 7 o'clock, I read the Times, the Telegraph, and the Morning Post. I reviewed the Foreign Office memorandum. I may have dozed for 10 or 15 minutes around 6:30. The warmth and the silence are conducive to brief naps. Holmes crossed immediately to the chair in question, his eyes narrowing as he examined it with the focused intensity of a jeweller appraising a diamond. He ran his fingers along the arms, probed the crevices where seat met back, even knelt to peer underneath. "The cushion has been recently disturbed," he announced. "See how it's slightly askew? Someone has moved it since you were last here, Mycroft. Looking for something, perhaps? Or simply a servant straightening up?" "Servants. Straighten at closing," Mycroft said, "which is at midnight. They wouldn't have reached this room yet." Watson moved to examine the small table beside the chair. It held an ashtray, unused, Mycroft being one of the few men in London who didn't smoke, and nothing else. The surface was clean, polished to a high shine that reflected the firelight. No dropped paper, no forgotten lists, no clues immediately apparent. Holmes stood and surveyed the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Watson had seen this stance 100 times before. This was Holmes assembling the puzzle pieces, rotating them in his mind, looking for the pattern that would make everything clear. "The room sees regular use?" Holmes asked. "Moderate," Mycroft replied. "Members come here when they must speak with guests or when business requires actual conversation, but it's not crowded. The appeal of the Diogenes Club is precisely that one need never speak if one doesn't wish to." "And this afternoon? Did you see anyone else while you were here?" Mycroft frowned, concentrating. "Havisham came in briefly around 5:30, spoke with a younger man I didn't recognise, his son perhaps from the resemblance. They left after 20 minutes. Lord Blackwood sat in that corner chair for an hour, reading and occasionally writing in a notebook. He didn't speak at all. A servant brought him whisky at 6. And, yes, there was one other. A newer member, I think. Youngish, perhaps 40, with greying temples and nervous hands. He sat for 15 minutes, seemed agitated, then left abruptly. "Did you interact with any of them?" "Of course not. That would defeat the purpose of being here." Holmes smiled faintly. "Even at a club designed for silence, you managed to be the most uncommunicative of all." He turned slowly, examining the room from different angles. "Let me reconstruct your afternoon. You arrived at 5:15, took your usual chair, began reading. The list was in your inner waistcoat pocket at this point. You felt it there, you said. At some point over the next hour and 45 minutes, it vanished. Either it fell out..." He knelt again, this time examining the floor around the chair with minute attention, even using his fingers to probe the gap between floorboards. "Or it was taken. Though why anyone would steal a shopping list is beyond even my imagination, unless..." He looked up sharply. "Unless someone thought it was something else entirely. A document of state importance, perhaps. You do occasionally carry those, I presume?" "Occasionally," Mycroft admitted, "though never anything truly sensitive. I'm not a complete fool." "Debatable," Holmes murmured, but quietly enough that Mycroft could pretend not to hear. Watson, meanwhile, had moved to examine the fireplace. The grate held the remains of a substantial fire, burned down now to glowing embers that pulsed gently with each draught from the chimney. He poked at them experimentally with the iron, sending up a small shower of sparks. "Could it have fallen into the fire?" he suggested. "If the pocket was loose," and Mycroft leaned forward. "I didn't lean forward," Mycroft said with the absolute certainty of a man who knew his own habits intimately. "I sat quite still, as I always do. Leaning suggests restlessness, and I am never restless when reading." Holmes had moved to the windows now, examining the sills, the curtains, even the gap between window and wall. He was being thorough, Watson knew, even though his instincts probably already told him the list wasn't in this room anymore. This was Holmes being methodical, covering every possibility before moving to his next theory. The silence of the club pressed in around them, broken only by the soft sounds of their search and the perpetual whisper of the fire. Somewhere in the building a clock chimed 9, a single clear note that hung in the air before fading into the pervasive quiet. "It's not here," Holmes said finally, straightening up and brushing dust from his knees, "which means it left this room somehow, either in someone's possession or..." He paused, his eyes brightening. "Or attached to something else, something that was in this room and is now elsewhere." "Such as?" Mycroft asked. "Your newspapers, for instance. Where are they now?" "Returned to the reading room, I should think. Members read them here, then servants replace them on the racks for others to use. And the memorandum you reviewed. I took it with me when I left. It's on my desk at home." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we need to speak with the servants. Someone who was working this room between 7 o'clock and now. Someone who might have found a wayward piece of paper and..." "What? Kept it? Discarded it? Turned it over to the management?" He looked at his brother. How does the club handle found items? There's a small office near the entrance. Lost property goes there. But surely if someone had found the list and turned it in, I would have been informed by now. Would you? You left at 7. It's now past 9. 2 hours is hardly an eternity. Perhaps it's sitting in that office right now, waiting for someone to claim it. Holmes moved toward the door. Let's ask, shall we? Though we'll need to be creative about what exactly we're asking for. I don't suppose we can simply inquire about a missing shopping list. Without raising questions you'd prefer remain unraised. Mycroft's expression suggested he was already regretting this entire enterprise. We'll say I lost a memorandum, something official but not classified. Dull enough to be believable, Holmes agreed. Perfect. Lead on, brother. Let's see what the efficient servants of the Diogenes Club have collected in their lost and found. They made their way back through the silent corridors, past the still-reading members and ever-watchful servants, through the hushed cathedral of masculine solitude that Mycroft called his sanctuary. And Watson, walking behind the Holmes brothers, couldn't help but think that of all the strange places this friendship had taken him, opium dens and criminal lairs, country manors and London slums, this silent club, with its enforced quiet and its exiled speech, might be the strangest yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall over London, covering everything in forgiving white, and the city settled deeper into its winter night. The lost property office of the Diogenes Club was precisely what one might expect from an institution dedicated to order, silence, and the proper management of gentlemanly affairs, which is to say it was immaculate, methodical, and somewhat soul-crushingly dull. It occupied a small room tucked behind the main staircase, easily overlooked unless one knew where to look. The door was unmarked save for a discreet brass number, 7 for reasons no one seemed able to explain, and opened onto a space barely large enough for 2 people to stand comfortably. Shelves lined 3 walls, each carefully labelled with dates and categories. Umbrellas, walking sticks, gloves, hats, spectacles, books, newspapers, and a catch-all labelled miscellaneous that seemed to contain everything from collar studs to what appeared to be a false moustache. The servant who attended to this domain was a man of perhaps 60, with the stooped shoulders of someone who'd spent decades bending to pick up after others. His name, Mycroft informed them in a whisper, was Higgins, and he'd been with the club for 40 years, starting as a boot boy and working his way up to the prestigious position of head porter, a role that encompassed everything from managing the door to maintaining this small archive of forgotten things. Higgins received their inquiry with the solemn attention one might give to a request from the Queen herself. When Mycroft explained in carefully vague terms that he'd misplaced a document of a professional nature, possibly in the stranger's room that afternoon, the porter's lined face creased with concern. "I shall check immediately, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the faint burr of somewhere north. Yorkshire, perhaps, or Durham. He turned to his shelves with the careful movements of age, running one finger along the labels until he found what he sought. Papers and documents today's date. Ah, yes. He withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by handling, and set it on the narrow desk that occupied the room's only free wall. Inside were perhaps a dozen items, a letter still in its envelope, addressed but apparently never sent, a page of mathematical calculations that would have given Watson a headache just looking at, a shopping list for mundane items, soap, bootblack, collar studs, that was decidedly not Mycroft's, and several scraps of newspaper with various articles circled in pencil, but no folded list, no embarrassing catalogue of Christmas gifts, nothing that belonged to Mycroft Holmes. "I'm afraid there's nothing here matching your description, sir," Higgins said, genuine regret in his voice. "Though I've only just come on duty an hour past. Simpson had the afternoon shift. He might have found something and not yet logged it properly. Shall I inquire?" "Please," Mycroft said, and the single word carried more anxiety than Watson had ever heard him express. Higgins departed on his errand, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who knew that rushing only led to mistakes. The 3 men were left in the small office, surrounded by the detritus of forgetfulness, the silent testimony to the absent-mindedness of even the most brilliant minds. Holmes had already moved to examine the shelves, his fingers trailing along the spines of forgotten books, the handles of abandoned umbrellas. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The things people leave behind, each one a small story, if you know how to read it." "This is hardly the time for philosophical musings," Mycroft said tightly. "On the contrary, It's always the time for observation. Look here. This umbrella has been repaired at least 3 times, always in the same spot. Its owner is either remarkably loyal to a damaged object or quite poor. Given that he's a member of the Diogenes Club, loyalty seems more likely. And these spectacles, the left lens is significantly stronger than the right, suggesting progressive deterioration of vision in one eye. Their owner should see an ophthalmologist soon, though he probably won't. Watson smiled despite himself. This was Holmes in his element, extracting stories from objects the way other men extracted juice from lemons. And what about this walking stick, the one with the silver handle? Holmes picked it up, examining it with the focused attention he gave to everything. Expensive, custom-made, probably on Jermyn Street. But notice the wear pattern on the handle. It's been gripped primarily by the left hand, while the tip shows the wear of someone who puts their weight on it when using stairs. Left-handed, arthritic hip, probably early 60s based on the progression of wear. Ah, and there's an inscription. He tilted it to catch the light. To J.M. from A.M., Christmas 1882. A gift from a spouse, perhaps, or a sibling. Either way, someone cared enough to have it engraved, and he cared so little he left it here. Or forgot it, Watson suggested. We rarely truly forget things that matter to us, Watson. We misplace them, certainly, but forgetting requires a degree of indifference that loving gifts seldom inspire. Mycroft, who had been pacing in the small space available, stopped and turned to his brother. While your deductions are no doubt brilliant, might we focus on finding my property rather than analysing everyone else's? Before Holmes could reply, Higgins returned, accompanied by a younger man, Simpson presumably, who carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that in service, expression, was a liability. He was perhaps 30, clean-shaven, with intelligent eyes that had learned to see much while appearing to notice nothing. "Mr. Simpson," Higgins said formally, "these gentlemen are inquiring about a document that may have been found in the stranger's room this afternoon. Did you come across anything of that nature?" Simpson's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "The stranger's room, sir? What time would this have been?" "Between 5:15 and 7 o'clock, Mycroft said. A folded paper, possibly fallen from a pocket or tucked beneath a cushion. I did my rounds of the stranger's room at 7:30, sir, after the last member departed. I found nothing of that sort, though—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Though I did notice something unusual, if I may say so." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his entire attention focused on the young man. "Please, any detail, however small?" Simpson glanced at Higgins, who nodded encouragement. "Well, sir, when I entered to tidy the room and bank the fire, I observed that one of the armchairs, the one nearest the fire facing the window, had its cushion quite disturbed. Not just sat upon, you understand, but actively moved, as if someone had been searching beneath it." "Searching," Holmes repeated softly. "Not simply straightening or adjusting?" "No, sir. I've been in service 15 years, 12 of them here at the club. I know the difference between a cushion displaced by sitting and one that's been deliberately lifted and replaced carelessly. This was the latter." Mycroft's face had gone very still. "And was anyone in the room when you arrived?" "No, sir. Quite empty. Though I had passed Mr. Hartley in the corridor not 2 minutes before. He seemed, if I may be frank, sir, he seemed somewhat agitated, in a hurry, not his usual manner at all." "Hartley," Mycroft said, and there was something in his voice that made Watson look at him sharply. "Edmund Hartley?" "I believe that's his name, sir. Newer member, joined perhaps 6 months ago. Works in—" Simpson paused, clearly uncertain whether he should continue. "The Foreign Office," Mycroft finished grimly. "Third assistant to the Under-Secretary for European Affairs. Ambitious, clever, and entirely too curious about matters that don't concern him." Holmes's eyes had taken on a predatory gleam. "You think he took it?" "I think," Mycroft said carefully, "that if anyone at the club would recognise the potential value, or rather the potential embarrassment, of finding a personal document belonging to me, it would be Hartley. The man has been angling for promotion for months. Anything he could use as leverage." "But it's a shopping list," Watson protested. "Surely even an ambitious bureaucrat wouldn't stoop to blackmail over Christmas gifts." "You underestimate the pettiness of governmental politics, Watson," Mycroft said darkly, "and the lengths to which small men will go to appear larger than they are." Holmes turned back to Simpson. "This Mr. Hartley, did you notice anything else about him? Was he carrying anything? Papers, perhaps?" Simpson thought carefully. He had his overcoat over his arm, sir, though the evening was cold enough he should have been wearing it, and he seemed to be holding it rather carefully, as if something might be tucked within it. But that's merely an impression, you understand. I couldn't swear to it. Impressions are often more valuable than certainties, Holmes said. They represent the unconscious mind noticing patterns the conscious mind hasn't yet articulated. Is Mr. Hartley still in the club? I believe he departed shortly after I saw him, sir. I heard the front door perhaps 5 minutes later, and Higgins here mentioned seeing Mr. Hartley leave in some haste. Indeed I did, Higgins confirmed. Didn't even pause for his usual word with me, and Mr. Hartley is generally a polite gentleman, always has a pleasant greeting. But tonight he fairly rushed past, barely nodded. I thought perhaps he'd received bad news or remembered an urgent appointment. Holmes was already moving toward the door, that familiar energy animating his lean frame. Then we need to know where Mr. Hartley has gone. Does the club keep records of members' addresses? Higgins drew himself up with affronted dignity. The Diogenes Club maintains the strictest confidentiality regarding its members, sir. I could hardly— I am a member myself, Mycroft interrupted, his voice taking on the tone of absolute authority that could reduce junior ministers to stammering apologies. And the matter concerns my property, removed from club premises without permission. I believe that constitutes grounds for disclosure. The two servants exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that develops between people who work together for years and learn to read each other's smallest gestures. Finally, Higgins gave a minute nod. Mr. Hartley resides in chambers on Half Moon Street, he said quietly. Number 14, third floor. Though I must stress that this information will go no further than necessary, Holmes assured him. You have my word, and my brother's, that your discretion will be matched by our own. They took their leave of the small office, but not before Holmes had pressed a half-crown into Simpson's hand and another into Higgins. For your invaluable assistance, he said, and your remarkable powers of observation, Mr. Simpson. You would have made an excellent detective. Simpson's careful neutrality cracked just enough to show pleasure at the compliment. Thank you, sir. I hope you recover your property. As they made their way back through the silent halls of the club, past the reading members and the watchful servants, past the enforced quiet and the cultivated solitude, Watson found his mind turning to these men who made the club function. They were the invisible machinery, the ones who maintained the illusion that a gentleman's comfort simply materialized without effort or human intervention. In the Victorian world, servants occupied a peculiar space, essential yet unacknowledged, present yet invisible, trusted with the most intimate details of their employers' lives, yet expected to remain utterly discreet. They saw everything and were supposed to notice nothing. They heard every conversation, every argument, every whispered secret, and were required to forget it all the moment they left the room. And yet Watson knew from his own experience managing a household, servants were people with their own thoughts, their own judgments, their own complicated feelings about the families they served. They formed their own hierarchies below stairs, their own allegiances and rivalries. They knew things about their employers that those employers would be horrified to realize were common knowledge in the kitchen. Simpson, for instance, had clearly developed quite a sophisticated understanding of the club's members, their habits, their patterns. He'd noticed Hartley's agitation because he'd already established what Hartley's normal behaviour looked like. He'd recognized the displaced cushion because he knew how cushions should look after normal use. These were not the observations of a mere servant following routine, but of an intelligent man actively engaged with his environment. How many other observations did Simpson have locked away in his mind? How many small dramas had he witnessed while moving through the club's rooms on his endless rounds of tidying and maintenance? And what did he think of these gentlemen who paid substantial fees for the privilege of not speaking to each other? They emerged from the club into the December night, where the snow had stopped falling but lay thick and pristine over everything. The street lamps made the white surface glitter like scattered diamonds, and the air had that peculiar clarity that comes after snowfall, as if the world had been scrubbed clean. Half Moon Street, Holmes said briskly, already orienting himself. Not far, 20 minutes' walk if we're brisk about it. Should we not send a message first? Watson suggested. Calling unannounced at this hour would give Hartley time to dispose of the evidence if he has it, Holmes countered. No, the element of surprise is our ally here. Besides, if he's innocent, our arrival merely confirms his innocence. If he's guilty, his reaction will tell us everything we need to know. Mycroft had been silent since leaving the club, his face set in grim lines. Now he spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been embarrassment or might have been anger. I should never have brought that list to the club, should never have written it in the first place. Sentiment is a luxury I cannot afford. Everyone is entitled to sentiment, Watson said firmly. Even you, Mycroft. Perhaps especially you. Kind of you, to say, Doctor. But in my position, kindness, toward others or oneself, is often mistaken for weakness. And weakness in Whitehall is blood in the water. The sharks circle endlessly, waiting for any sign of vulnerability. Holmes glanced at his brother, and for just a moment his usual mockery was absent. Then we'll simply have to retrieve your list before the sharks catch the scent, won't we? Come on, Half Moon Street awaits, and with it, hopefully, the end of this ridiculous adventure. They set off through the snow-covered streets, 3 men on the trail of a piece of paper that should have meant nothing but somehow meant everything. Behind them, the Diogenes Club settled deeper into its nightly silence, its members reading and drinking and thinking in splendid isolation, while the servants who made that isolation possible moved through the rooms like ghosts, seeing everything, saying nothing, remembering far more than anyone suspected. The city stretched around them, vast and indifferent, 4 million people pursuing 4 million separate purposes beneath the same cold stars. And somewhere in that vastness, Edmund Hartley sat in his chambers on Half Moon Street, possibly holding a piece of paper that could embarrass one of the most powerful men in England, or possibly holding nothing at all, innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, they would soon know. The night was young, and Baker Street's strangest case was far from over. The walk to Half Moon Street had seemed brief in prospect, but proved considerably longer in reality, particularly when one factored in the snow-covered pavements, the bitter cold that seeped through even the best wool coats, and Mycroft's increasingly laboured breathing as they navigated the slippery streets. By the time they reached the Georgian townhouse that contained Edmund Hartley's chambers, all 3 men were pink-cheeked and thoroughly chilled, their breath forming small clouds that hung in the still air like visible thoughts. Holmes had rung the bell with characteristic determination, and they'd waited in the bitter cold while someone, a landlady presumably, made their slow way to the door. When it finally opened, they were greeted not by suspicious inquiry but by firm information. Mr. Hartley had departed not an hour before for his family's country estate in Hertfordshire, catching the last train from King's Cross. He would not return until after Christmas. No, he had left no messages, received no visitors, and appeared to be in perfectly ordinary spirits when he'd collected his bags and departed. The news had settled over Mycroft like a fresh layer of snow, cold, unwelcome, and impossible to shake off. Holmes had asked a few more questions, established that Hartley had indeed been carrying his overcoat rather carefully, as if something might be tucked within it, and then admitted temporary defeat. We could telegraph the estate, he'd suggested as they stood, on the pavement, watching their breath mist in the lamplight. And say what? Mycroft had replied wearily. That we suspect him of taking a shopping list, that we demand he search his pockets for evidence of accidental theft. The man would think us mad, and he'd be half right. Then we wait until he returns after Christmas, Watson had offered. Surely it can keep that long. It's not as though the contents are time-sensitive. But Mycroft's expression had suggested that time was very much of the essence, though he wouldn't say why. And so they had turned back toward Baker Street, the case temporarily stalled, the mystery temporarily unsolved, all 3 men thoroughly frozen and not particularly inclined toward further investigation in the immediate future, which was how they found themselves, at nearly 10:30 on a December evening, climbing the familiar stairs to 221B, with frost still clinging to their coats, and the warmth of Mrs. Hudson's sitting room calling to them like a siren's song. Holmes had his key halfway to the lock when the door swung open of its own accord, or rather, of Mrs. Hudson's accord, for she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that Watson had learned to recognise as the prelude to non-negotiable instruction. "I heard you on the stairs," she said without preamble, "and before any of you says a word about going back out into that dreadful cold, or Mr. Mycroft taking himself off to his lodgings, I'll tell you plain, you're staying for supper, all 3 of you, and I won't hear otherwise. Mrs. Hudson, Mycroft began, mustering what remained of his dignity. I couldn't possibly impose. Impose? She stepped aside to let them enter, but her tone suggested this was less invitation and more command. Mr. Holmes, you're frozen half to death. You've been rushing about London on some mysterious errand that's left you looking like a whipped dog, and if you think I'm letting you go back out into that weather without a proper meal inside you, then you don't know me at all. She turned her formidable attention to Sherlock. And you, dragging your brother and the good doctor all over creation at this hour in this cold. What could possibly be so urgent that it couldn't wait for morning? Holmes opened his mouth, caught the look in her eye, and wisely closed it again. That's what I thought, Mrs. Hudson continued with satisfaction. Now coats off, all of you. I've kept the fire built up, and there's a chicken in the oven that won't eat itself. You'll stay, you'll dine, and you'll not leave until you've thawed properly and had something sensible to eat. Dr. Watson looks half-starved as it is. I'm perfectly sick, Watson began, but she silenced him with a look. You're thin as a rail and you know it. Too busy looking after everyone else to look after yourself. Well, tonight I'm looking after all of you, and that's final. There was simply no arguing with her when she took this tone. It was the voice of landladies eternal, the voice that had managed households and stubborn lodgers since time immemorial. The voice that combined maternal concern with administrative authority in a way that reduced even the most independent of men to grateful compliance. Mycroft, who was unaccustomed to being managed by anyone, found himself divested of his coat and settled into the chair nearest the fire before he quite realised what was happening. Holmes surrendered his own outerwear with better grace, recognising defeat when he saw it, and Watson simply smiled and did as he was told, as he generally did where Mrs. Hudson was concerned. The sitting room had been transformed in their absence. The fire blazed cheerfully, sending dancing shadows across walls and ceiling. The lamps had been lit and turned to their warmest glow, casting everything in tones of amber and gold. The table had been set for 3 with Mrs. Hudson's good china, not the everyday stuff she used for breakfast, but the pieces with the delicate floral pattern that had belonged to her mother. Cloth napkins, proper cutlery, even a small vase of evergreen sprigs that filled the room with the scent of winter forests, and the food. Dear God, the food! Mrs. Hudson had clearly been cooking for hours. A roasted chicken, golden and glistening, occupied pride of place on the table. Around it clustered serving dishes of winter vegetables, carrots glazed with honey, parsnips roasted until their edges caramelized, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, potatoes whipped with butter and cream until they resembled clouds. There was fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and a dish of butter yellow as sunshine. A gravy boat steamed gently, and there, on the sideboard, sat the promised mince pies alongside what looked like a trifle assembled with the kind of care usually reserved for architectural projects. The warmth of it all, the fire, the food, the simple domestic comfort, hit Watson with unexpected force. This was what soldiers dreamed of in frozen trenches, what travellers yearned for in foreign lands, what every person secretly craved: home, hearth, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to make an effort. Mrs. Hudson, he said quietly, this is extraordinary. She coloured slightly, pleased but trying not to show it. It's just supper, Doctor, nothing fancy. It's considerably more than just supper, and you know it, Mycroft said, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice. This is a feast, madam. We are honoured. Well then, sit down and honour it by eating, she said briskly, though Watson could see the satisfaction in her eyes. I'll bring up the tea, proper tea, mind you, not that paint stripper Mr. Holmes usually drinks, and then I'll leave you gentlemen to your meal and your mysterious business. She bustled out, leaving them in the warm glow of the sitting room, surrounded by more food than 3 men could reasonably be expected to consume, the case temporarily forgotten in favour of immediate creature comfort. They were just settling into their chairs, Watson reaching for the carving knife, when they heard the street door open below, followed by the unmistakable heavy tread of someone climbing the stairs, with the deliberate pace of official business. Now who on earth, Holmes began, but the question was answered before he could finish it. Inspector Lestrade appeared in the doorway, snow still dusting his shoulders, his thin face ruddy from cold, carrying a large tin decorated with cheerful images of holly and ivy. He stopped mid-step when he saw the assembled company, his expression shifting from professional purpose to mild confusion to genuine pleasure in the space of 3 seconds. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," and "Good Lord, is that Mycroft Holmes? I didn't know you ever ventured this far from Whitehall." He held up the tin almost apologetically. "My wife sent biscuits. She always makes too many at Christmas, insists I share them round, and I thought, well, I was passing, and I hoped you might." He trailed off, taking in the laden table. "But I see you're about to dine. I'll not intrude." "Nonsense," Watson said warmly, already fetching another chair. "Mrs. Hudson has provided enough food for a regiment. Join us, Lestrade. We'd be glad of the company." "Are you certain? I don't want to—" "Inspector," Mycroft said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. "If you leave now, Mrs. Hudson will have both our heads. She's in a mood to feed people, and resistance is not only futile, but frankly ungracious. Please, sit." Lestrade needed no further encouragement. He set the biscuit tin on the sideboard, shed his coat, and settled into the 4th chair with the grateful sigh of a man who'd been on his feet too long. "Truth be told, I've had nothing but a sandwich since noon. The wife's visiting her sister, and when she's away I tend to forget about proper meals." "Then you've come to the right place," Holmes said, serving out chicken with surprising competence. "Though I warn you, joining us means you're now part of whatever Mrs. Hudson has planned, and her plans are generally non-negotiable." As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Hudson reappeared with the tea service, and, seeing Lestrade, simply nodded, as if his presence confirmed something she'd expected all along. "Inspector, good. You look half-starved. There's plenty for everyone, so eat up." She poured tea with the practised efficiency of a long habit, placed the pot where everyone could reach it, and then, with a final satisfied look at her handiwork, withdrew to let them eat in peace. For several minutes there was little sound beyond the comfortable noises of dining. Cutlery against china, the soft pour of tea into cups, the occasional murmur of appreciation. The food was, as Watson had known it would be, superb. Mrs. Hudson had learned to cook in an era when butter and cream were not yet enemies of health, when a proper meal was expected to be substantial, enough to fuel a day's work, and when flavour mattered more than fashion. The chicken was moist and perfectly seasoned, the vegetables were cooked with care rather than boiled into submission, and the bread was the kind that made one understand why people spoke of the staff of life with reverence. Even Holmes, who often treated eating as an annoying necessity, put away a respectable portion and reached for seconds. Lestrade, who had started the meal with the polite restraint of an unexpected guest, gradually relaxed into genuine appetite. "My compliments to Mrs. Hudson," he said, helping himself to more potatoes. "This is finer than anything I'd get at Simpson's." "Don't let her hear you say that," Watson advised. "She'll insist you come for every meal and we'll never be rid of you." "Could do worse," Lestrade replied with a grin, "though I suppose my wife might object to me taking all my meals at Baker Street." The conversation drifted easily, the way it does when people are comfortable with each other and food has softened the edges of formality. Lestrade shared news from Scotland Yard. Nothing serious, just the usual Christmas chaos of pickpockets, working the shopping crowds and drunken altercations that ended in black eyes rather than bloodshed. Holmes offered a few sardonic observations about the Metropolitan Police's methods, but gently, without his usual acid. Even Mycroft, who had started the meal looking like a man facing execution, began to unbend slightly, the warmth and food working their magic on his stiff reserve. "I actually did have a reason for stopping by," Lestrade admitted as they cleared their plates. "Nothing urgent, just a bit of a puzzle that's been nagging at me. Thought Mr. Holmes might have a perspective." "Always happy to assist the Yard," Holmes said, though his eyes gleamed with interest. "What's the puzzle?" "Missing jewellery, but not stolen, at least not in any conventional sense. Lady Pemberton claims her diamond bracelet vanished from her dressing table sometime between Monday and Wednesday, but there's no sign of forced entry. None of the servants have left service or shown any unusual spending, and the lady herself admits she might have simply misplaced it. She's getting on in years, bit forgetful, but the family's insisting on a full investigation." "And you think?" Holmes prompted. "I think it's probably tucked in a drawer somewhere and will turn up the moment we close the case," Lestrade said with the weary wisdom of long experience. "But I have to go through the motions. Was wondering if you had any suggestions for places to search that might not be obvious." Holmes considered. "Has anyone checked inside the other jewellery? Sometimes small items slip inside larger boxes or cases, or checked whether the lady has any hiding places she's forgotten about. People who are starting to lose their memory often hide valuables, and then forget they've done so. Both good thoughts, Lestrade said, pulling out a small notebook to jot them down. I'll mention it to my sergeant. Mycroft, who had been listening with half an ear while working on his third helping of Brussels sprouts, suddenly spoke. Missing items that aren't actually stolen, misplaced rather than removed with intent. How common is that, Inspector? Lestrade shrugged. More common than actual theft, to be honest, especially this time of year. People rushing about, distracted by Christmas preparations, putting things down in odd places. Half my caseload in December is tracking down items that turn out to be exactly where the owner left them, once they calm down enough to remember properly. Something passed across Mycroft's face. Hope, perhaps, or relief. Watson caught Holmes noticing it too, and the brothers exchanged a look that communicated volumes without a single word spoken. The meal wound down naturally, plates emptying, teacups refilled, the comfortable satiation of good food well shared settling over the company like a warm blanket. Outside, the winter night pressed against the windows, but inside the fire burned bright and the company was warm, and for this moment at least Baker Street felt less like lodgings and more like home. The dishes had been cleared away. Mrs. Hudson had returned, refused all offers of help with a firmness that brooked no argument, and departed with the loaded tray muttering something about men underfoot in kitchens. She'd left behind a fresh pot of tea, the mince pies arranged on a plate with the kind of artistry that suggested she took personal pride in her presentation, and Lestrade's tin of biscuits, which had been opened to reveal an impressive array of ginger snaps, shortbread, and something studded with candied fruit that looked simultaneously festive and slightly alarming. The fire had been built up again, sending shadows dancing across the ceiling in lazy patterns that drew the eye and quieted the mind. The lamps had been turned lower, creating pools of warm light that didn't quite reach the corners, where darkness gathered soft and comfortable. Outside, London had settled into its late evening rhythm, the occasional clatter of a hansom, the distant call of the watch, the perpetual low murmur of a city that never quite slept, but sometimes consented to rest. Holmes had claimed his armchair, long legs stretched toward the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that characteristic pose that meant his mind was working even as his body relaxed. Watson occupied his usual spot opposite, a mince pie balanced on a saucer, his eyes half closed in the kind of contentment that comes from warmth, food, and good company. Mycroft had remained at the table, turned sideways in his chair so he could see both the fire and his companions, a brandy, procured from Holmes' sideboard without permission but without protest, cradled in one large hand. Lestrade had settled into the fourth chair, the one usually reserved for clients but which tonight served as the inspector's throne, his own teacup steaming gently, his thin frame finally relaxed after what had clearly been a long day of official duties and unofficial frustrations. It was the kind of evening that invited storytelling, when the darkness outside made the light within feel precious, when time seemed to slow and expand, when even the most reserved of men might be coaxed into sharing pieces of themselves usually kept carefully guarded. "You know," Lestrade said, breaking the comfortable silence, "this reminds me of Christmas when I was a boy. The whole family crowded into my grandmother's sitting room, barely big enough for all of us, children underfoot, my mother and aunts in the kitchen, the men by the fire telling stories. My grandfather would wait until everyone had eaten their fill, and then he'd start in on his tales from when he was in the army. Most of them were probably nonsense, but we believed every word." Watson smiled. "My father was the same. He'd been a country doctor, seen all sorts of things in his time, and after Christmas dinner he'd settle in his chair and regale us with stories of midnight calls and mysterious ailments. My favourite was the one about the farmer who swore he was being poisoned. Turned out he'd been eating his wife's experimental preserves. She'd used the wrong kind of mushrooms. Did he survive? Lestrade asked. Barely. And he never questioned her cooking again, which my father claimed was the whole point of the exercise." Holmes made a soft sound of amusement. "Remind me never to anger Mrs. Hudson. She has access to far too many kitchen implements and a working knowledge of poisons from her years of tolerating my experiments. She wouldn't poison you," Watson said confidently. "She'd just make your life sufficiently miserable that you'd wish she had." "Fair point." Mycroft had been listening with an expression that suggested he was remembering something, though whether pleasant or painful, Watson couldn't quite tell. The firelight caught the lines of his face, making him look older than his years, but also somehow more human, less the governmental machine and more the man beneath. We had stories too, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made everyone turn toward him. Sherlock and I, when we were boys, before... He paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal. Before we learned that stories were less useful than facts, and imagination less valuable than deduction. Holmes looked at his brother with an expression Watson had rarely seen. Not mockery, not irritation, but something almost tender. "I remember," he said softly. "You used to make up tales about the people we'd see in the village. The baker was secretly a deposed prince. The vicar was a reformed pirate. Mrs. Whitmore, who kept the general store, was actually a spy for the French." "She did have a suspicious accent," Mycroft said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "She was from Cornwall." "Exactly. Who speaks like that unless they're hiding something?" Watson found himself leaning forward, fascinated by this glimpse into the Holmes brothers' childhood. Holmes spoke of his past so rarely that each detail felt like a small treasure, something to be examined and cherished. "You were close then, as children?" "We were all we had," Mycroft said simply. "Our parents were distant, not unkind, you understand, but occupied with their own concerns. We had governesses, tutors, all the usual trappings of a genteel upbringing. But the real education, the real companionship came from each other. You taught me to read," Holmes said, and there was something almost accusatory in his tone, as if this were a crime Mycroft had committed. "Properly read, I mean. Not the simple primers the governess used, but actual literature. I was 4 years old and you gave me Robinson Crusoe." "You were bored," Mycroft replied. "Insufferably, destructively bored. I thought the book might occupy you for a few days. Instead you read it in an afternoon and demanded more. I'd created a monster." "You'd created a reader. There's a difference." "Is there? I'm not convinced." Lestrade chuckled. "My youngest is the same. Once she learned to read, there was no stopping her. Her mother despairs of ever getting her to put down a book and help with chores." "Don't discourage it," Watson said firmly, speaking with the authority of a man who'd seen too many bright minds dimmed by lack of education. "A child who reads is a child who can teach themselves anything. Encourage her. Buy her books. Let her explore. Even if it means she neglects her duties. Especially then. The world has enough dutiful drudges. What it needs is people who can think, question, imagine." Holmes raised his teacup in salute. "Spoken like a true radical, Watson. I approve." The conversation drifted on, easy and unhurried, touching on childhoods and Christmases past, on the strange traditions that each family developed and cherished, on the way certain smells or songs could transport a person back to a time and place long gone. Lestrade shared a story about his first Christmas as a young constable, walking the beat in snow so deep it came to his knees, getting hopelessly lost in the East End, and being rescued by a flower seller who'd given him tea and directions and refused to accept payment. Watson spoke of his first Christmas in Afghanistan, celebrating with his regiment in a mud-brick fort, while snow fell on mountains they couldn't see through the darkness, trying to sing carols while the wind howled and everyone pretended not to be homesick. Even Holmes, who generally avoided personal revelation as if it were a communicable disease, offered a small memory. Christmas at university, snowed in at Cambridge with nowhere to go and no one to visit, spending 3 days alone in his rooms solving mathematical problems for the sheer pleasure of it, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that solitude suited him better than company. "Didn't you miss your family?" Lestrade asked. "I had books," Holmes replied, "and silence, and no one expecting me to make conversation or pretend interest in their tedious concerns. It was paradise." "That's rather sad," Watson observed. "Is it? I thought it was rather sensible." Mycroft had been quiet during these exchanges, his brandy slowly diminishing, his eyes fixed on the fire as if it held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. Now he set down his glass with a soft click and spoke, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone fall silent. "I've been thinking about what Lestrade said earlier, about misplaced items, about things that aren't stolen but simply lost because we were distracted, because we put them down without thinking, because we were too busy being important to pay attention to what actually mattered." He looked at Holmes, and there was something raw in his expression, something that reminded Watson that beneath the layers of authority and intellect and governmental power, Mycroft Holmes was simply a man who sometimes made mistakes and sometimes regretted them. "The list," Mycroft continued, wasn't particularly secret, wasn't particularly valuable, but it represented something I've spent most of my life trying to avoid, evidence that I care, that beneath all the calculations and political manoeuvring and careful distance, I actually feel things for people, specific people. That's not a weakness, Watson said gently, isn't it? In my world, any attachment is leverage, any affection is a tool someone can use against you. I've built a career on being untouchable, unreadable, unmoved by sentiment or emotion, and then I go and write a shopping list of gifts for people He stopped, took a breath. For people who matter to me. Mrs. Hudson, who's looked after Sherlock for years and never once complained about the explosions or the bullet holes or the irregular hours. You, Watson, who's given my brother something I never could. Friendship, loyalty, the kind of companionship that doesn't demand intellectual perfection. Even Lestrade, who tolerates Sherlock's insufferable superiority and still manages to work with him despite having every reason not to. Lestrade looked genuinely moved. Mr. Holmes, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Mycroft replied. I've already revealed far too much. The brandy is clearly stronger than I thought. But there it is, the great secret of the missing list. Not state secrets or financial information or anything that could topple governments. Just gifts. Thoughtful ones. Personal ones. The kind that would reveal me to be an actual human being rather than the calculating machine everyone prefers to believe I am. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, a church bell tolled 11, the sound muffled by distance and snow marking another hour past, in this strange, suspended evening. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the sideboard, returning with the brandy decanter. He refilled Mycroft's glass without asking, then poured measures for Watson and Lestrade, and even a small one for himself, rare enough to be noteworthy. A toast, he said, raising his glass, to secrets revealed in safety, to lists both lost and found, and to the surprising discovery that even the most formidable of men occasionally succumb to Christmas sentiment. I'll drink to that, Lestrade said warmly. And I, Watson added. Mycroft looked at them all, these three men who'd somehow become tangled in his moment of weakness, and something in his expression softened. Thank you, he said quietly, for not laughing, for not judging, for simply being here. Where else would we be? Holmes asked, and for once there was no sarcasm in his tone, no hidden barb, just simple honesty. They drank, the brandy warming as it went down, and the evening settled into an even deeper comfort. The mysteries and anxieties of the day seemed to recede, replaced by the simple pleasure of company freely given and freely accepted. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly, ostensibly to check if they needed anything, but really, Watson suspected, to ensure that Mycroft was being properly looked after. She caught the inspector's eye, nodded with satisfaction at the empty plates and the general air of contentment, and withdrew again with a small smile that suggested she knew exactly what she'd accomplished, by insisting they all stay for supper. You know, Lestrade said thoughtfully, in all my years at the Yard I've learned that the best investigations aren't always the ones that catch criminals. Sometimes the best ones are the ones that remind us why we do this work in the first place, to help people, to solve problems, to make things right when they've gone wrong. Even when the problem is a missing shopping list? Holmes asked with gentle mockery. Especially then, Lestrade replied seriously, because that's someone's peace of mind, someone's dignity, someone's private concerns that deserve protecting as much as any state secret, maybe more, because they're personal. Watson watched Mycroft's face as Lestrade spoke, and saw the gratitude there, the relief of being understood rather than ridiculed. This was what friendship looked like, he thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but simply showing up, sharing a meal, listening without judgment, and making space for vulnerability in a world that so often demanded constant strength. The fire burned lower, the night grew later, and the four men sat together in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow connected by the warm web of shared experience. Tomorrow they would resume the search for Mycroft's list. Tomorrow there would be plans and investigations and the usual dance of deduction and discovery. But tonight, there was only warmth and brandy and the unexpected grace of belonging. Morning arrived at Baker Street the way it usually did in December, reluctantly, as if the sun itself needed convincing that rising was worth the effort. The winter light, when it finally condescended to appear, was thin and pale, filtering through the frost-etched windows in shafts that seemed more grey than gold, casting the sitting room in tones of silver and shadow that made everything look slightly unreal, like a photograph slowly developing in a chemical bath. Watson woke first, as he often did, his internal clock still running on military time despite years of civilian life. He emerged from his bedroom to find the sitting room transformed overnight, not by any particular change in the furniture or arrangement, but by that peculiar quality that comes to familiar spaces after hosting unexpected warmth. The chairs still held the ghost impressions of bodies that had occupied them. The fire had burned down to ash, but the faint smell of wood smoke lingered, mingling with the remnant scents of last night's supper and the sharp, clean smell of cold air seeping through imperfectly sealed windows. Mycroft had remained at Baker Street, installed in the spare room usually reserved for Watson's occasional medical colleagues or Holmes's even more occasional family visits. The decision had been made somewhere around midnight, after the second round of brandy, when it became clear that sending Mycroft out into the frozen night was both impractical and unkind. He'd protested, naturally. Mycroft Holmes did not make a habit of imposing on others, even his own brother. But Mrs. Hudson had appeared with fresh linens and a hot water bottle, and that had been that. Lestrade had departed around 11:30, bundled back into his coat and sent off with a packet of leftover mince pies that Mrs. Hudson had pressed into his hands despite his protests. "For your breakfast," she'd insisted, "and don't tell me you'll make yourself something proper, because I know you won't. Men never do when their wives are away." Now, in the grey morning light, Watson moved quietly through the sitting room, building up the fire from last night's embers, adding coal and kindling with the practised efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The flames caught reluctantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, sending warmth radiating out into the cold room. Holmes emerged next, wrapped in his burgundy dressing gown, his hair still dishevelled from sleep, looking more human than he usually preferred to appear in daylight. He nodded to Watson, poured himself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had already brought up. The woman had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs, and settled into his chair with the morning papers, which had been delivered and left in their usual spot by the door. "Sleep well?" Watson asked quietly, mindful of Mycroft still resting in the next room. "Adequately. You?" "Very well, actually. That brandy knocked me right out." Holmes made a small sound of agreement and disappeared behind the Times, leaving Watson to his own thoughts and his own cup of tea. The morning routine was comforting in its familiarity, the quiet companionship, the slow awakening of mind and body, the gradual transition from sleep to full consciousness without rush or pressure. Mycroft appeared around 8:30, fully dressed despite the early hour, looking only marginally less imposing than usual. Sleep had softened some of the lines in his face, but the weight of his concern still showed around his eyes, the perpetual burden of a man who carried too many secrets and too much responsibility. "Good morning," Watson offered. "Tea? Please, and my apologies for imposing on your hospitality." "Nonsense," Holmes said from behind his paper. "The spare room exists to be used, and Mrs. Hudson was delighted to have someone to fuss over. You probably made her entire week." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Hudson herself appeared with a tray laden with breakfast. Porridge with cream and brown sugar, kippers still steaming from the pan, toast with butter and marmalade, and a fresh pot of tea that smelled of bergamot and better mornings. "I thought you gentlemen might want something substantial," she said, setting the tray on the table with practised efficiency. "Especially you, Mr. Mycroft. You barely touched dinner last night for all that you took 3 helpings of sprouts." "I touched plenty of dinner," Mycroft protested mildly. "You picked at it like a bird. Now sit down properly and eat. All of you." They obeyed, because one did not argue with Mrs. Hudson when she was in this mood, and besides, the food smelled magnificent. The porridge was thick and creamy, the kippers perfectly cooked, the toast just the right shade of golden brown. They ate in companionable silence, the morning gradually brightening outside, London waking up around them with the usual sounds of commerce and conversation. Watson was just reaching for his second piece of toast when they heard the street door open below, followed by the rapid ascent of someone taking the stairs 2 at a time. All 3 men looked toward the sitting-room door with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Early morning visitors were rarely good news, But it was only the telegraph boy, breathless and pink-cheeked from the cold, holding out an envelope with the priority markings that indicated urgent delivery. "For Mr. Mycroft Holmes," he announced, then looked around at the three men, clearly uncertain which was the correct recipient. "That would be me," Croft said, already reaching for his pocket to extract a coin for the boy. The telegram was read. The boy was tipped and dismissed, and Mycroft stood holding the small piece of paper with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, relief, and something that might have been chagrin. "Well," Holmes prompted, "it's from Hartley, Edmund Hartley." Mycroft read aloud. "Found item believed yours in coat pocket. Sending by special messenger this morning. Deepest apologies for confusion. Return after Christmas if convenient. Hartley." Watson felt a smile spreading across his face. So he did take it. Accidentally. It would appear so. Mycroft sat down heavily, the telegram still in his hand. All this fuss, all this anxiety, and it was simply a mix-up. He must have grabbed the wrong coat at the club, or my list fell and he picked it up thinking it was his own property. Holmes was grinning now, openly delighted. So no grand theft, no political machinations, no blackmail scheme, just simple human error. Mycroft, I have to say, this is possibly the most anticlimactic case I've ever investigated. "I'm perfectly content with anticlimactic," Mycroft replied dryly. "Climactic would have involved me becoming the subject of governmental gossip for the next 6 months." "When will the messenger arrive?" Watson asked practically. "Hartley says this morning. Could be any time now." Mycroft looked down at his breakfast, then back at the telegram, then at his brother. "I feel rather foolish, if I'm honest. All that concern over something so simple." "Don't," Holmes said, his tone gentler than usual. "Things that matter to us always feel more significant than they appear to outside observers. That's what makes them matter." They returned to breakfast, though the mood had shifted. Lighter now, tinged with relief and the particular satisfaction that comes from problems resolving themselves more easily than anticipated. Mrs. Hudson reappeared to clear plates and refill teacups, and though she didn't ask directly about the telegram, her knowing look suggested she understood that whatever crisis had driven them through snowy London the previous evening had reached some sort of resolution. The messenger arrived at 9:30, a young man in the livery of a private courier service, carrying a sealed envelope that he handed over with a brief bow. Mycroft signed for it, tipped the messenger generously, and then stood in the middle of the sitting room, holding the envelope as if it might explode. "Open it," Holmes urged. "The suspense is killing Watson. Look at him. He's practically vibrating with curiosity." "I am not," Watson protested, though he absolutely was. Mycroft broke the seal and withdrew 2 items, a folded piece of paper, the list presumably, and a brief note written in a neat, educated hand. He read the note first, and Watson watched his expression soften. "What does it say?" Holmes asked when Mycroft didn't immediately share. "He apologises profusely, says he was in a rush yesterday afternoon, feeling unwell, and grabbed his coat from the rack in the club's cloakroom without checking carefully. When he reached his chambers and emptied his pockets before packing for the country, he found my list mixed in with his own papers. He recognised my handwriting from office memoranda, realised what must have happened, and sent the telegram immediately. And the list itself?" Mycroft unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. A complicated expression crossed his face, part relief, part embarrassment, part something Watson couldn't quite identify. After a long moment he refolded it and tucked it into his inner pocket. "Well," Holmes prompted, "aren't you going to share? After all we went through?" "Absolutely not. The contents are private, and they shall remain so." "Come now, Mycroft. We've earned at least a glimpse. You've earned my gratitude, which you have, but not a reading of my personal correspondence, no matter how much you wheedle." Holmes sat back in his chair, laughing. "Fair enough, though I maintain that after last night's brandy-induced confessions, there's very little mystery left about what that list contains. Perhaps, but confirming speculation would be poor form, and I do have some dignity left to preserve." Watson, watching this exchange, felt a warm satisfaction settle over him. This was brotherhood at its best. The teasing and the boundaries, the pushing and the respecting, the intimacy that allowed for both vulnerability and privacy. The Holmes brothers had spent the evening revealing more of themselves than either usually permitted, and now they were reconstructing their usual dynamic, but with something new underneath it. Understanding, perhaps, a recognition of shared humanity. I should return to my lodgings, Mycroft said, finishing his tea. Change into fresh clothes, attend to accumulated correspondence, resume my normal routines. Thank you both for... He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to what he wanted to express. For last night, for helping, even when the problem seemed trivial, for treating me, with respect rather than mockery. We did mock you a bit, Holmes pointed out fairly. Yes, but gently. I appreciate the restraint. Watson rose and offered his hand, which Mycroft shook firmly. Any time, Mycroft. You're always welcome here, crisis or no crisis. I'll remember that, though I hope not to need rescuing from my own shopping lists again any time soon. Holmes walked his brother to the door and Watson heard them speaking quietly in the hallway, words he couldn't quite make out but whose tone suggested affection, wrapped in the careful language the Holmes brothers used to avoid excessive sentiment. Then Mycroft was descending the stairs, his heavy tread receding, the street door opening and closing, and the sound of his footsteps crunching away through snow that had frozen overnight into a crust of glittering ice. Holmes returned to the sitting room and stood at the window, watching his brother's retreating figure make its way down Baker Street. The morning light caught his face in profile, highlighting the sharp planes and angles that sometimes made him look severe, but now simply made him look thoughtful. You were kind to him, Watson observed. He's my brother. Kindness is occasionally permitted, even between siblings who make a career of intellectual sparring. It suited you. The kindness, I mean. Holmes turned from the window and offered Watson a small, genuine smile. Don't let word get out. I have a reputation to maintain. Your secret is safe with me. They settled back into the morning. The crisis passed. The friendship deepened. The day stretching ahead with its usual promises of routine and possibility. Outside, London continued its endless business. But inside 221B Baker Street, two men sat in comfortable silence, drinking tea and reading newspapers while the fire crackled, and Mrs. Hudson hummed to herself in the kitchen below. Some problems, Watson reflected, solved themselves with nothing more than patience and trust. Some mysteries resolved into simple misunderstandings, and some of the best cases were the ones that reminded everyone involved of what really mattered. Not the complexity of the puzzle, but the people trying to solve it together. The list had been found. The embarrassment had been avoided. And somehow, in the process, something more valuable had been discovered. The knowledge that even the most formidable of men needed help sometimes, and that offering it, freely without judgment, was perhaps the greatest gift anyone could give. The afternoon settled over Baker Street with the particular stillness that comes to winter days, when the sky remains overcast, and the temperature hovers just cold enough to discourage unnecessary ventures outdoors. It was the sort of afternoon that invited people to remain exactly where they were, to find contentment in small spaces and simple pleasures, to let the world turn without them for a few hours. Watson had attempted to leave after lunch, a modest affair of soup and bread that Mrs. Hudson had brought up without being asked, claiming he had correspondence to attend to and patients to visit. But Holmes had looked at him with that peculiar expression that suggested Watson's presence was both expected and required, and somehow Watson had found himself still in his chair an hour later, reading a medical journal while Holmes played scales on his violin with the absent-minded precision of someone warming up for a performance that would never come. The surprise came at 2:30, when they heard the street door open and the familiar heavy tread ascending the stairs. Both men looked up, exchanging puzzled glances. Mycroft had left hours ago, heading back to his own lodgings and his own life. What could possibly have brought him back? He appeared in the doorway looking somewhat wind-blown, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, carrying a large basket covered with a cloth, and wearing an expression that hovered somewhere between determination and embarrassment. "I thought," he said without preamble, "that we should finish what we started last night. Properly, I mean, with the appropriate gestures and acknowledgements." Holmes set down his violin, eyebrows raised. "Mycroft, are you feeling quite well? You're being unusually cryptic even for you." "I'm feeling perfectly well, and I'm attempting, in my admittedly awkward fashion, to express gratitude." He set the basket on the table and pulled back the cloth to reveal an impressive array of items: a bottle of excellent port, a wheel of Stilton cheese, a box of crystallized ginger, a small tin that proved to contain some sort of expensive tea, and several packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Watson stared. "Mycroft, you didn't need to. I know I didn't need to. I wanted to. These are the items from my list, or some of them at any rate. I thought, since you'd all become inadvertently involved in the saga of their planning, you might as well receive them properly." He began unpacking with the careful movements of someone not entirely comfortable with gift-giving, but determined to do it correctly regardless. "The port is for you, Sherlock. I know you claim not to care about such things, but I've noticed you have a palate for good wine when you bother to pay attention. This is from a private collection, rather special." Holmes took the bottle with something approaching reverence, examining the label with genuine interest. "This is a 63. Mycroft, this is far too generous." "It's exactly as generous as I intended it to be. Accept it gracefully, or I'll be forced to take it back and drink it myself, which would be a terrible waste given that I prefer brandy." He turned to Watson, holding out one of the wrapped packages. "For you, Doctor. I hope I've chosen correctly. Sherlock mentioned you'd been looking for a particular edition, and I took the liberty of tracking it down." Watson unwrapped the package with careful fingers, revealing a leather-bound copy of Gray's Anatomy. Not just any edition, but the revised 4th edition he'd been hoping to find for months, its pages crisp and clean, its binding still tight. He looked up at Mycroft, genuinely moved. "This is... Mycroft, I don't know what to say. This must have cost a fortune." "Knowledge should never be rationed by cost. Besides, you're the one who keeps my brother alive and relatively sane. That's worth considerably more than a medical text." The third package, smaller than the others, Mycroft set aside with a murmured, "For Mrs. Hudson. I'll give it to her before I leave." Holmes had opened the port and was examining it with the focused attention he usually reserved for crime scenes. "You know what this requires, don't you? We can't simply let you distribute gifts and disappear back into the winter afternoon. That would be remarkably poor form. I wasn't planning on staying. Nevertheless, you will. Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called toward the door, his voice carrying down the stairs with the projection of long practice. "Would you join us for a moment, and bring glasses, please, the good ones?" There was a brief pause, then the sound of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs with her customary efficiency. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression curious. "Mr. Holmes, what do you need?" "Your presence and your best crystal," Holmes said, already moving to clear space on the table. "Mycroft has returned bearing gifts, and Watson has reminded me that civilized people mark such occasions with ceremony rather than simply stuffing cheese into their mouths like savages." "I said no such thing," Watson protested. "You were thinking it. I could tell." Mrs. Hudson disappeared and returned moments later with a tray holding 4 crystal glasses that Watson had never seen before, clearly reserved for occasions far more elegant than the usual Baker Street chaos, and set them down with the satisfied expression of a woman whose secret cachet of nice things had finally found purpose. Mycroft, meanwhile, had unwrapped the package intended for her, revealing a beautifully embroidered shawl in deep burgundy wool, its edges finished with delicate fringe, the kind of garment that was both practical and lovely, functional and thoughtful. "For you, Mrs. Hudson," he said, offering it with surprising gentleness. "Sherlock tells me you're often up and down these stairs in all weather, and I thought you might appreciate something warm." Mrs. Hudson's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, her eyes bright. "Mr. Holmes, this is far too fine for the likes of me. It's exactly fine enough for someone who's tolerated my brother's explosions, bullet holes, and general disruption of domestic peace for years without complaint. If anything, it's insufficient compensation, but it's offered with genuine appreciation." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders immediately, and Watson noticed how perfectly it fit, how the colour brought out the warmth in her complexion. This wasn't a hastily chosen gift. This was something selected with care, with attention to detail, with the kind of thoughtfulness that came from actually seeing another person, rather than simply acknowledging their functional presence. "Now then," Holmes said, pouring port into the 4 glasses with the careful precision he brought to everything when he chose to pay attention. "A toast is required. The question is, to what?" "To found lists," Watson suggested with a smile. "To accidental theft and apologetic bureaucrats," Holmes offered. "To the Diogenes Club and its spectacular failure to keep my secrets," Mycroft added dryly. Mrs. Hudson, settling into the 4th chair as naturally as if she'd always belonged there, smiled at them all with the affectionate exasperation of someone who'd heard far too much nonsense from clever men and had learned to love them for it anyway. "To Christmas," she said simply, "and to remembering that even the cleverest people need help sometimes, and that asking for it isn't weakness, it's wisdom." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with recognition and respect. Holmes, who would normally deflect such sentiment with a sardonic comment, simply nodded. Mycroft, who spent his life maintaining emotional distance, allowed himself a genuine smile. Watson, who understood the courage it took to be vulnerable, raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. "To Christmas," Holmes said quietly, "and to wisdom we didn't know we needed." They drank, the port rich and complex on the tongue, warming as it went down. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Winter days were so desperately short, but inside the sitting room, the lamps glowed warm, and the fire sent shadows dancing across walls that had witnessed so many strange scenes and unlikely gatherings. "You know," Watson said after a moment, "when you first arrived last night, Mycroft, I thought this was going to be another of those Byzantine governmental crises that would involve coded messages and international intrigue and possibly people shooting at us in dark alleys." "I'm sorry to have disappointed you," Mycroft replied with gentle mockery. "I'm not disappointed at all. This was better, more real somehow, more human." "Human," Mycroft repeated the word as if testing its weight. "I've spent so much of my career trying to avoid being human, trying to be the calculator, the machine, the mind without messy attachments or inconvenient feelings. And yet here I am, brought to Baker Street by a shopping list and rescued by the very people I was trying to hide my sentiments from." "Not rescued," Holmes corrected gently. "Accompanied. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Rescued implies helplessness. Accompanied implies choice. Yours and ours. You chose to ask for help. We chose to give it. That's friendship, not rescue." Mrs. Hudson, who had been quiet while the men talked, spoke up now. "You're a good man, Mr. Mycroft. Too hard on yourself, perhaps, but good. And these gifts," she touched the shawl still wrapped around her shoulders, "they tell me you see people. Really see them. Not just what they do for you, but who they are. That's rarer than you might think." "My brother sees people," Mycroft said. "Sees them so clearly it's occasionally uncomfortable for all involved. I merely observe facts." "You see us," Watson said firmly. "You knew I'd been looking for that edition of Gray's. You chose Port Sherlock would appreciate rather than something generically expensive. You selected a shawl for Mrs. Hudson that's both beautiful and practical, in colours she actually wears. Those aren't facts, Mycroft. Those are observations born of care." Mycroft looked into his glass as if it might contain an escape route from this conversation. Finding none, he sighed. "Perhaps, though I maintain that sentiment in my profession remains a liability." "And I maintain," Holmes said, refilling glasses with the bottle that was already half empty, "that a profession that requires you to abandon sentiment entirely is one that will eventually consume you. You need these anchors." He gestured around the room, encompassing them all. "These reminders that you're more than just governmental machinery. We all do." "Spoken like a man who keeps a skull on his desk and conducts chemistry experiments at 3 a.m, Mycroft observed. "Even consulting detectives need anchors. Why do you think I tolerate Watson's endless medical journals cluttering my sitting room? Why do you think Mrs. Hudson has survived 6 years of my worst behaviour without evicting me?" "Because you're secretly rather fond of us," Watson suggested. "Secretly nothing. Obviously fond of you. Publicly, demonstrably fond of you. I'm simply not tediously effusive about it." Mrs. Hudson laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Mr. Holmes, you're many things, but not effusive might be stretching the truth. I've heard you wax poetic about tobacco ash for 45 minutes. That's different. Tobacco ash is fascinating. People are simply necessary." "Necessary," Watson repeated, grinning. "I'll take it. Mycroft, your brother thinks I'm necessary. I believe that's the closest he's come to declaring affection in our entire acquaintance." The afternoon wore on, the port diminishing steadily, the conversation ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous, with the easy comfort of people who'd learned to enjoy each other's company, without performance or pretense. Holmes told a story about a case from years ago that had involved a missing parrot and a member of Parliament with a guilty conscience. Mrs. Hudson shared memories of past lodgers she'd housed before the Holmes brothers came into her life, painting portraits of eccentricity that made even Sherlock seem relatively normal. Watson spoke of his plans to write up some of their adventures, and the half-hearted protest from Holmes that fooled no one. Mycroft, loosened by Port and Company, revealed small glimpses of his work that wouldn't compromise security, but illustrated the absurdity of governmental bureaucracy. The committee formed to decide whether to form another committee. The memorandum that took 6 weeks and 17 drafts to say what could have been communicated in a single sentence. The territorial disputes between departments that would have been comical if they weren't occasionally consequential. The light outside faded to full darkness, the street lamps flickering to life one by one along Baker Street. The temperature dropped further, frost beginning to form new patterns on the windows, but inside the sitting room warmth held sway. The fire had been built up twice more. The port bottle stood empty, replaced by tea for those who'd had enough alcohol and brandy for those who hadn't. At some point, without anyone quite deciding it should happen, this gathering had transformed from obligation into celebration. Not celebration of anything in particular, not Christmas, not the recovery of the list, not even the Holmes brothers' rare moment of open affection, but simply celebration of being together, of having found each other across the vast indifference of London, of creating this small island of connection in a city designed to keep people separate and self-contained. "I should go," Mycroft said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "It's getting late, and I do have work tomorrow." "You should stay," Mrs. Hudson countered. "The spare room is still made up, and you've had enough port that venturing out into the cold seems inadvisable." "I've had 2 glasses." "3," Holmes corrected. "I was counting." "You're always counting. It's deeply irritating." "And yet you love me anyway." Mycroft looked at his brother for a long moment, and something passed between them that needed no words, no explanation, no translation into explicit sentiment. "Yes," he said simply. "I suppose I do." "Then stay," Watson urged. "Start the tradition of the Holmes brothers actually spending time together when there isn't a national crisis requiring it. Revolutionary concept, I know, but you might find you enjoy it." And so Mycroft stayed, because the port was good and the company was better, and because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is accept comfort when it's offered, rather than retreating to the safety of solitude and self-sufficiency. They talked long into the evening, until Mrs. Hudson finally excused herself to her own rooms, wrapped in her new shawl and carrying a contentment that glowed brighter than any lamp. The 3 men remained, the detective, the doctor, and the governmental mastermind, finding unexpected harmony in their differences, unexpected peace in their shared presence. Outside, London slept fitfully, as it always did, the great city never quite still but sometimes quiet enough to pass for peaceful. Inside 221B Baker Street, the fire burned low, and the conversation grew softer, more contemplative, touching on philosophy and memory and the strange paths that lead people to each other. And when they finally retired, Watson to his room, Holmes to his, Mycroft to the spare room that was becoming less spare and more simply his, each carried with them the knowledge that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but genuinely. The Holmes brothers had allowed themselves to be seen, and in being seen, had been accepted. Watson had witnessed a vulnerability in Mycroft he'd never expected to encounter. Mrs. Hudson had been honoured not as a servant but as family. The missing list, that small piece of paper that had started this entire adventure, rested safely in Mycroft's pocket now. But the real gift, the one that couldn't be wrapped or bought or tracked down in specialty shops, had been given freely by all of them to each other. The gift of presence, of patience, of allowing connection to matter more than pride. As Watson drifted towards sleep, warm under his blankets while frost painted new masterpieces on his window, he smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow Mycroft would return to, being the calculating mind behind the government. Holmes would return to his cases and his chemistry, and his general disdain for ordinary human interaction. Mrs. Hudson would return to managing her impossible lodgers with exasperated affection. But tonight they had been simply themselves, simply together, simply enough. And that, Watson thought as sleep finally claimed him, was perhaps the truest mystery worth solving. How to build a family from choice rather than blood, from affection rather than obligation, from the conscious decision to show up for each other when it mattered most. The case of the missing list was closed, but the story it had revealed, of brotherhood and friendship, of vulnerability and acceptance, of the small kindnesses that sustain us through winter's cold. That story would continue, unfolding in quiet moments and unexpected gatherings, in the spaces between words and the gestures that say what language cannot. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering Baker Street in forgiving white. Inside, 3 men slept in peace, and Mrs. Hudson smiled in her dreams, and London, indifferent and eternal, kept its vigil through the longest night, waiting for morning to bring its particular grace to those willing to receive it. And so, dear listener, as the fire dims and the snow continues to fall over London, we leave our friends to their peace. May you find the same warmth they discovered, in unexpected places, with unlikely people, when you're brave enough to ask for help and wise enough to accept it when offered. Sleep well, wherever you are in this wide world. Until we meet again in another story, another time, another gentle mystery that reminds us what it means to be human and connected and home.